The war had raged for years, tearing apart the lands and lives of millions, yet none of the stories carried more weight than those hidden behind closed doors, whispered in shadows, and etched into the memories of young German women whose fates were cruelly bound to the tides of battle. Their world had been shattered piece by piece from the moment they were taken from the homes they barely remembered to the places they could only dream of escaping. The comfort girls, as they were coldly called, were more than prisoners. They were symbols of a broken humanity caught between hate and survival. From the early days, the women had learned to live in silence, their voices swallowed by fear and shame. Each dawn brought new horrors masked beneath the cold routines of camp life. Their bodies betrayed them, but their minds clung to fragments of hope scattered like broken glass across the years. Some dared to believe that beyond the barbed wire and watchful eyes, there might still be a future. That did not include pain or despair. The journey to the camp had been a nightmare. None wanted to speak of the train rattling through desolate landscapes, carrying them away from the remnants of a world that once felt safe. The faces around them were haunted, some hollowed out by loss, others hardened by the need to survive, all trapped in a nightmare. They could neither escape nor understand. Among them was Liesel, a girl barely 19 with eyes too old for her years. She had been taken from a small village where her family had once laughed and loved before the war stole everything. Her hands trembled as she clutched a faded photograph of her mother, a silent promise to endure no matter what awaited her. The other women shared similar stories, though few spoke aloud their names or histories for fear of inviting more pain. Each woman carried a secret burden, a wound that could never fully heal. Theirs was a sisterhood, forged not by choice but by circumstance, bound by silence and shadows. As the train screeched to a halt, the women were herded into trucks, their footsteps echoing against cold metal as they approached the POW camp. The guards barked orders sharp and unyielding, but the women moved like ghosts, resigned to whatever fate the war had carved out for them. The camp itself was a stark contrast to the battlefields they had fled, from barbed wire fences, towering watchtowers, and rows of barracks painted in shades of gray and despair. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where the past and future merged into a bleak present. Inside the camp, the women were processed like prisoners of war, stripped of their identities and given numbers instead of names. Liesel's heart pounded as she was led through the gates, the weight of unknown futures pressing down on her like a suffocating fog. The other women whispered prayers under their breath, clutching whatever talismans they could find to ward off the creeping terror. Every face was etched with a mix of fear, defiance, and a desperate yearning for something more, something better than the nightmare they had been thrust into. The first night was the hardest, as the women huddled together in the cold barracks, the thin blankets barely shielding them from the chill. The sounds of distant artillery and the restless shuffling of guards outside were reminders that the war was far from over. Yet here in this small corner of the world, the women faced a different kind of battle, one that tested their souls and their will to survive. Liesel closed her eyes, clutching the photograph tightly, willing herself to remember who she was, beyond the horrors that threatened to consume her. Days passed with an unbearable slowness, each marked by the same routines, the same watchful eyes, and the same silence broken only by the occasional sob or whispered conversation behind closed doors. The women learned to move quietly to avoid drawing attention and to hide the traces of their suffering beneath forced smiles and careful gestures. It was a delicate dance of survival, where any misstep could lead to punishment. Or worse, the camp was a cage. Yet within it flickered small moments of humanity, a shared glance, a whispered word, a fleeting touch. that reminded them they were still alive, still human, despite everything. Among the American soldiers guarding the camp, there was an unexpected sense of order and discipline that baffled the women. They were not the monsters the women had feared, but men who seemed to carry their own burdens and scars from the war. Each encounter was a study in contrasts, the women's guarded mistrust meeting the soldiers' careful respect. It was as if an unspoken agreement had been made to protect the fragile dignity of those captured, to preserve a thread of decency amidst the chaos. Liesel found herself watching the soldiers from the shadows, noting the way their eyes held a mix of weariness and resolve. Their faces were lined with exhaustion, but their actions spoke of a commitment to a code that valued respect, even in the face of hatred. It was a strange comfort that brought both relief and confusion to the women who had expected only cruelty. Yet beneath the surface of civility lay an undercurrent of tension, a fragile balance waiting to be shattered by forces unseen and choices yet to be made. As the days grew longer and the nights colder, the women began to forge bonds of friendship and solidarity that defied the bleakness surrounding them. They shared stories of lost childhoods, dreams deferred, and hopes for a world that might one day heal. Their voices were soft but determined, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Even in the darkest moments there was light, a stubborn flicker that refused to be extinguished. But the peace was fragile, fragile enough to be broken by the slightest whisper or the most unexpected visitor. The camp held secrets buried beneath its quiet surface, secrets that threatened to unravel the delicate trust painstakingly built between captors and captives. A shadow loomed on the horizon, one that promised to change everything. The women's pasts colliding with their uncertain futures, leaving them to wonder who would survive, and what price would be paid when the truth finally came to light. And as Liesel sat alone in the fading light, clutching her photograph, she knew that the story was far from over, that the next chapter would test them all in ways they could never have imagined. The war was not just outside the gates, it was inside each heart and mind, a battle between hope and despair, between silence and the need to be heard. The Comfort Girls had endured enough, but the fight for their dignity was only just. Beginning arrival at the camp had been nothing like the women had feared or imagined. There was a strange calm in the air as the trucks rattled over the gravel path and the barbed wire fences loomed large against the pale sky. The women clung to one another, their breaths shallow, their eyes wide with a mixture of hope and dread. The guards barked orders, but there was no cruelty, no harsh words, only firm gestures guiding them inside to a place that was both prison and refuge. The American soldiers moved with a disciplined efficiency that was unfamiliar to the women who had braced themselves for brutality. Liesel and the others were herded into a large hall where they were met by officers whose faces were stern but not unkind. The process of registering the prisoners was methodical and clinical. Yet there was an undercurrent of respect that caught the women off guard. They were asked their names and histories in quiet tones and given clean clothes and food for the first time in what felt like ages. The women exchanged wary glances, unsure if this was some cruel trick or a genuine act of kindness. The soldiers seemed to understand the fragile state of their captives and handled them with a care that made the women's hearts flutter with a confusing mixture of relief and suspicion. Despite the small comforts, the reality of their situation sank in quickly. The camp was surrounded by fences and watchtowers, and the women knew that freedom was a distant dream. Their days became marked by routines, inspections, meals, and guarded moments of conversation, whispered in corners away from prying eyes. The soldiers never pried into their pasts, nor forced them into roles that would deepen their humiliation. Instead, there was a strange, tacit understanding that some lines must never be crossed. A boundary of privacy was respected, as if the soldiers knew that these women had already been through too much and deserved at least this shred of dignity. Liesel found herself drawn to a small garden behind one of the barracks, a patch of earth where wildflowers struggled to bloom. She would sit there in the early mornings, watching the sun cast long shadows and feeling the cool breeze against her skin. It was one of the few places where she could breathe without the weight of fear pressing down on her. The other women joined her when they dared, sharing silent moments of solace, as if the flowers themselves held some secret power to heal wounds unseen. The American soldiers were a mystery to them. They carried weapons and authority, but their faces told stories of exhaustion and loss. Many were young men barely older than the women themselves. Some had joined the army out of duty, others out of desperation. Each carried a burden that was invisible to the prisoners but palpable in the way they moved and spoke. The women watched as the soldiers maintained order, not through fear, but through a quiet strength that spoke of hard-earned respect. The camp became a strange liminal space, a place where enemies could coexist without hatred, but also without trust. Rumors began to circulate among the women, whispers of strange visits and secret meetings at night. Liesel heard the murmurs in the barracks that some of the soldiers had been seen talking in hushed tones with the officers, but no one knew what was said. There was talk of a mysterious visitor, someone who might hold answers to questions that no one dared ask. The women speculated endlessly about who this person could be, whether they were friend or foe, and what their arrival might mean for their fragile peace. The air grew thick with anticipation and unease as the day of the visitor's arrival drew near. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of red and gold, Liesel stood near the fence, lost in thought, when a sudden hush fell over the camp. The guards moved with unusual urgency, and a convoy of vehicles approached the gate. The women were told to stay inside their barracks, but the tension was palpable. The soldiers exchanged quick glances and whispered orders. The arrival was unlike anything the camp had seen before, and everyone sensed that the balance they had fought to maintain was about to be broken. The visitor was a man whose presence seemed to command the very air around him. His eyes were sharp and calculating. Yet beneath the surface lay something unreadable. A hush fell as he walked among the soldiers, speaking in low tones, his gaze lingering on the women with an intensity that sent chills down their spines. Liesel felt her heart race as questions swirled in her mind. Who was this man? What did he want? And why had he come to this forgotten corner of the war? A storm was gathering, and the calm before it was about to shatter, leaving the women and the soldiers to confront truths that could not be ignored. Whispers of betrayal began to circulate, fueled by fear and uncertainty. The women questioned if this visitor was a harbinger of doom or a bearer of hope. Their fragile trust wavered as suspicions grew and alliances shifted in the shadows. The camp that had once felt like a strange sanctuary now felt like a powder keg waiting to explode with consequences that no one could predict. The past and present collided in a dangerous dance, leaving everyone wondering who would survive and what secrets would be revealed when the dust finally settled. Liesel sat alone that night, clutching the photograph of her mother, her thoughts a tangled web of fear, hope, and determination. The arrival of the visitor had changed everything, and she knew that the next days would test their strength in ways they could never have imagined. The war was far from over, and the true battle for their souls was only beginning. The comfort girls were no longer just prisoners. They were survivors standing on the edge of an uncertain future, waiting for the dawn to break. Days stretched into weeks within the confines of the camp. A fragile routine had taken hold, but beneath the surface tension simmered like a hidden flame. The women moved through their days with careful steps, guarding their secrets, while the soldiers maintained their watchful vigilance, yet none could ignore the shifting undercurrents that whispered of change. Liesel had become a quiet observer, absorbing the small details, the exchanged glances, the hurried whispers, and the subtle shifts in behavior that spoke of something unsaid, something that hovered just beyond the reach of understanding, threatening to unravel, the fragile peace. The mysterious visitor had stayed longer than anyone expected each day, bringing new questions and unease. His presence seemed to cast a shadow over the camp, altering the rhythms of life and stirring old wounds that some had hoped to keep buried. The soldiers who once moved with steady resolve now appeared restless, their conversations laced with caution and sometimes fear. The women watched as friendships and loyalties were tested, the lines between captor and captive blurring, in ways that left everyone uncertain of who they could trust. Liesel found herself drawn deeper into the tangled web of secrets as she cautiously befriended one of the soldiers, a young man named Jack, whose eyes held a sadness that mirrored her own. Their conversations were guarded, but genuine moments of connection flickered like fragile flames against the cold backdrop of war. Jack spoke in whispers of the horrors he had seen and the burdens he carried of a world shattered by conflict. Yet even in his stories, there was a yearning for something better, for a peace that seemed just beyond reach. Their shared pain created a fragile bond, a thread of humanity in a place where trust was scarce. Meanwhile, rumors of betrayal grew louder, fueled by fear and paranoia. The visitor's motives remained unclear, and his actions more enigmatic each day, raising the stakes for everyone in the camp. Some whispered that he was a spy sent to uncover secrets. Others believed he might be a negotiator, seeking to broker peace, or perhaps a harbinger of darker forces intent on exploiting their vulnerability. The ambiguity gnawed at the edges of their fragile existence, turning every glance into suspicion, every gesture into a potential threat. One night, as a storm raged outside, lashing the camp with wind and rain, Liesel overheard a clandestine conversation between the visitor and one of the senior officers, their voices low and urgent. The words were fragmented and cryptic, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. Something was coming. Something that would force the women and soldiers to confront the truths they had long avoided. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within the camp, a prelude to a reckoning that no one could escape. The women gathered in hushed circles, sharing fears and hopes, their faces etched with worry and determination. They knew that the fragile peace was hanging by a thread, and that the choices they made in the coming days could alter their fate forever. Liesel looked around at the faces she had come to trust, the faces of survivors, bound by shared suffering and unspoken courage. Yet beneath the surface lay questions that refused to be answered, and a fear that the past might come crashing down upon them all. As dawn broke, the storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered in the heavy silence that filled the camp. The visitor called a meeting, a gathering that would bring together soldiers and prisoners alike to face the realities that had been simmering beneath the surface. The air was thick with anticipation and dread as everyone waited for the truth to be revealed, for secrets to be laid bare, and for destinies to be decided. The comfort girls stood at a crossroads, caught between past and future, unsure of which path would lead to salvation and which to ruin. In the final moments before the meeting, Liesel clutched her photograph close, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. She knew that whatever happened next would change everything, that their lives would never be the same. The war was no longer just a battle fought on distant fields, but a war within themselves, a fight for dignity, trust, and the right to be heard. The camp held its breath, waiting for the storm to break and for the truth to set them free or destroy them all. The morning dawned gray and heavy, as if the sky itself bore the weight of what was to come. The camp was unusually quiet. The usual sounds of footsteps, murmurs, and distant orders muted by the looming sense of inevitability. Liesel stood among the other women, their faces pale and drawn shadows of the strength they had carried so far. Yet beneath the exhaustion lay a fierce determination to face whatever truths the day would bring together or apart. The visitor had called the meeting to the central hall, a cold room where walls seemed to close in with the pressure of secrets long buried. The soldiers gathered on one side, their expressions unreadable, their posture tense as they awaited the arrival of those held captive. The women assembled opposite their eyes, searching for any sign of mercy or betrayal in the faces of their captors, and the man who had disrupted the fragile peace, as the visitor stepped forward. His presence filled the room, commanding attention. His voice steady, yet edged with urgency. He began to speak of alliances broken and forged, of secrets that had been kept in darkness for too long. He revealed the reasons for his visit, a mission, not just to interrogate, but to seek a path toward reconciliation, a hope to end the suffering through understanding. Yet the words rang hollow to many who had seen too much pain and too many betrayals to believe in easy answers. Suddenly, accusations flew from both sides. Old wounds, torn open, fears unleashed as the walls of civility crumbled. The visitor's intentions were questioned, his loyalties doubted, and soon the room descended into chaos. Voices raised in anger and desperation, the fragile bonds of trust shattered like glass underfoot. Liesel found herself caught in the storm, her heart pounding as she tried to hold on to the thread of hope that had brought her this far. But the weight of history pressed down too hard. In the midst of the turmoil, a figure stepped forward, a soldier known for his stern discipline. His voice cutting through the clamor with a harsh clarity, he demanded that the truth be laid bare, that no more lies be tolerated, that the comfort girls be given a choice, a voice in their fate, and that the soldiers be held accountable for their actions. The room fell into stunned silence, the call for justice hanging heavy like a challenge thrown into the abyss. Liesel's eyes met Jack's across the room, a silent understanding passing between them that the battle was no longer just about survival, but about reclaiming their humanity and dignity. The visitor's presence had ignited something long dormant, a fire that refused to be quenched by fear or silence. The camp was no longer a place of prisoners and guards, but a crucible where the future would be forged from the ashes of the past. As the meeting drew to a close, orders were given to separate the groups, the tension simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for the next spark to ignite the fragile peace. The women retreated to their barracks, their minds racing with questions and fears.